The mechanical roar that once echoed across European battlefields had fallen to an ominous whisper by the winter of 1944. Colonel Friedrich von Manteuffel stood beside his immobilized Panzer IV, watching as American Sherman tanks rolled past his position with the confidence of predators who knew their prey had no escape. What the German officer couldn't have imagined was that barely 200 miles away, American forces possessed over 3.3 million gallons of precious fuel stored in just 2 strategic depots, while his own war machine ground to a halt for want of a single drop of gasoline. The irony was devastating in its completeness. The same Wehrmacht that had once blitzkrieged across Poland, France, and deep into Soviet territory now found itself reduced to horse-drawn artillery and soldiers pushing disabled vehicles by hand. The fuel shortage that plagued German forces wasn't merely a logistical inconvenience. It represented the death knell of Hitler's war machine, a mechanical heartbeat that had finally stopped beating. In the American camps, the situation couldn't have been more different. Major General John Richardson walked through the vast fuel depot at Cherbourg, his boots echoing against concrete as he surveyed row upon row of fuel barrels stretching beyond the horizon. The sight was almost overwhelming. Millions of gallons of high-octane gasoline, diesel fuel, and aviation gas, all waiting to power the Allied advance into the heart of the Third Reich. The contrast between the two armies had become a study in industrial might versus desperation. While German tank crews learned to siphon fuel from abandoned vehicles and mix alcohol with whatever petroleum products they could find, American supply officers complained about having too much fuel to properly manage. The abundance was so great that some forward units actually requested fewer fuel deliveries, unable to store the massive quantities being pushed toward the front lines. Richardson paused beside a particularly large section of the depot where technical sergeants were calculating daily consumption rates. The numbers were staggering. Even with thousands of vehicles operating at full capacity, the Americans were accumulating fuel faster than they could use it. This wasn't merely military superiority, it was the manifestation of an entire industrial civilization focused on a single goal. The German fuel crisis hadn't developed overnight. Years of Allied bombing had systematically destroyed synthetic fuel plants across occupied Europe, while naval blockades prevented crude oil imports from reaching Axis refineries. What had once been Germany's greatest strength, its mechanized warfare capability, had become its most glaring weakness. The very tanks that had terrorized Europe now sat silent in forests and fields, their crews reduced to infantry without the mobility that had made them legendary. As evening approached, Richardson could hear the distant rumble of American aircraft returning from bombing runs deep into German territory. Each plane represented hundreds of gallons of fuel consumed, yet the depot's reserves seemed inexhaustible. The mathematical reality was becoming clear to military strategists on both sides. This war would be decided not by courage or tactical brilliance, but by the simple equation of petroleum availability versus petroleum demand. The strategic implications of America's fuel abundance versus Germany's petroleum poverty became apparent to intelligence analysts throughout the European theater during the autumn of 1944. Lieutenant Colonel James Murphy, Chief Logistics Officer for the Third Army, maintained detailed records that painted a picture of overwhelming American material superiority that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. According to classified reports, later declassified by the National Archives, American forces were consuming approximately 40,000 gallons of fuel daily for every armored division in active combat. Yet their reserves continued growing exponentially. The two primary depots, one at Cherbourg and another at Antwerp, contained enough fuel to maintain full combat operations for 18 months, even without additional supply shipments from the United States. The German situation presented a stark mathematical contrast. Oberst Hans Dietrich, commanding the remnants of the 7th Panzer Division, submitted reports to Army Group West indicating that his entire division possessed less fuel than a single American armored company typically consumed in 1 week of operations. His Panthers and Tigers, once the terror of Allied tank crews, had been reduced to stationary artillery pieces, unable to maneuver or conduct the rapid advances that had characterized early German victories. Murphy's documentation revealed the extent of American fuel wealth through meticulous record-keeping. Every gallon was accounted for, from the massive strategic reserves down to individual vehicle allocations. The complexity of managing such abundance created its own challenges. Fuel quality control, distribution scheduling, and storage security required unprecedented organizational efforts. Teams of petroleum engineers worked around the clock ensuring that aviation gasoline didn't contaminate tank fuel, that diesel supplies remained separate from gasoline reserves, and that proper additives prevented fuel degradation during extended storage periods. The psychological impact on German forces proved as devastating as the tactical limitations. Panzer crews who had once ranged freely across battlefields now calculated every mile in terms of precious fuel consumption. Tank commanders developed elaborate fuel-sharing schemes, transferring gasoline from disabled vehicles to those still capable of movement. Some units resorted to diluting their remaining fuel with captured alcohol, creating combustible mixtures that damaged engines but provided temporary mobility. American abundance, meanwhile, created different problems entirely. Fuel trucks sometimes waited hours to unload their cargo at forward depots, already operating beyond capacity. Some units received more fuel than their organic transportation could carry, requiring additional vehicles just to transport petroleum products. The logistical challenge shifted from scarcity management to abundance management, a problem no military had previously encountered on such a scale. Intelligence reports from captured German documents revealed the extent of their fuel crisis in stark detail. Wehrmacht quartermasters calculated remaining fuel supplies in liters rather than thousands of gallons, with some divisions possessing less petroleum than American reconnaissance units used for routine patrol activities. The disparity had grown so extreme that German forces began planning operations based entirely on fuel availability rather than tactical objectives. The strategic situation became self-reinforcing. American fuel abundance enabled aggressive reconnaissance and rapid tactical movements that disrupted German supply lines, further reducing their already limited fuel availability. Meanwhile, German fuel shortages prevented effective counter-reconnaissance and limited their ability to conduct the mobile operations necessary to interdict American supply convoys. As winter approached, the fuel equation became even more critical. Cold weather increased fuel consumption for both sides, but while Americans simply allocated additional fuel supplies, German forces faced the prospect of completely immobilized armor. The mathematics of modern warfare had reduced complex military strategies to a simple petroleum calculation. Victory belonged to whoever could keep their machines running. Behind America's staggering fuel reserves lay an industrial mobilization unprecedented in human history, a transformation that converted the world's most productive economy into an unstoppable military machine during the critical years of 1942 through 1944. The petroleum infrastructure supporting Allied operations in Europe represented more than military logistics. It embodied the complete industrial might of a continent-sized democracy focused entirely on victory. Standard Oil of New Jersey, Texaco, and other major petroleum companies had expanded their refining capacity by 300% since Pearl Harbor, according to wartime production records maintained by the War Production Board. New refineries sprouted across the American Gulf Coast, each facility capable of producing more aviation gasoline in a single day than Germany's entire synthetic fuel industry could manufacture in a week. The numbers were almost incomprehensible. American petroleum production exceeded 15 billion gallons annually, while German synthetic fuel plants struggled to produce 500 million gallons under constant Allied bombing. The logistics of transporting this petroleum wealth across the Atlantic Ocean required an equally impressive maritime mobilization. Liberty ships converted specifically for fuel transport crossed the ocean in convoys protected by destroyers and escort carriers, their holds containing millions of gallons destined for European battlefields. Each convoy carried more fuel than the entire German Wehrmacht possessed at any given time, yet these shipments represented routine supply runs rather than extraordinary efforts. Captain Wilhelm Hoffmann of the German intelligence service had spent months analyzing captured American logistics documents, trying to understand the scope of Allied petroleum capabilities. His reports to Wehrmacht High Command painted a picture of industrial capacity so vast that German leadership initially dismissed the intelligence as propaganda or miscalculation. The reality proved even more overwhelming than Hoffmann's most pessimistic estimates suggested. American fuel depots in Europe employed thousands of personnel dedicated solely to petroleum management. Specialized tank farms covered hundreds of acres, with underground storage facilities designed to withstand artillery bombardment and aerial attack. The Cherbourg depot alone employed more petroleum engineers than Germany's entire fuel distribution system, while the Antwerp facility processed more fuel in a single week than some German armies received in an entire month. The technological sophistication of American fuel management systems provided additional advantages beyond mere quantity. High-octane aviation gasoline enabled Allied aircraft to operate at higher altitudes and carry heavier payloads than German fighters running on increasingly diluted synthetic fuel. American tank gasoline contained specialized additives that improved engine performance and reduced mechanical failures, while German forces mixed alcohol and other substitutes that damaged equipment and reduced operational reliability. German attempts to disrupt American fuel supplies proved largely futile against such overwhelming abundance. Luftwaffe bombing raids against Allied depots, even when successful, merely reduced American fuel reserves from 18 months' supply to 17 months and 3 weeks. The mathematical impossibility of significantly impacting such vast reserves became apparent to German strategic planners, who realized that their entire remaining air force couldn't destroy enough American fuel to meaningfully affect Allied operations. The petroleum abundance enabled American forces to conduct operations that would have been impossible for fuel-conscious armies. Reconnaissance units routinely consumed more fuel in a single patrol than German companies possessed for week-long operations. American tank crews learned to operate their vehicles at maximum engine settings, knowing that fuel constraints would never limit their tactical options. The industrial infrastructure supporting this petroleum flow included not only refineries and tanker ships, but also specialized equipment for fuel quality testing, storage tank construction, and pipeline installation. American engineers laid petroleum pipelines across France as quickly as infantry advanced, ensuring that fuel supplies kept pace with tactical developments. This infrastructure represented a logistical capability that exceeded many nations' entire industrial capacity. The fuel crisis that paralyzed German armored forces during the winter of 1944 extracted a human toll that extended far beyond military casualties, transforming proud tank crews into desperate infantry and exposing the Wehrmacht's most experienced soldiers to dangers they had never anticipated during years of mechanized warfare dominance. Obergefreiter Klaus Weber had commanded a Panzer IV since the invasion of Poland in 1939, leading his crew through France, the Low Countries, and deep into the Soviet Union. By December 1944, Weber found himself pushing his 30-ton tank by hand alongside his crew members, trying to move their immobilized war machine closer to German lines before American forces could capture both vehicle and personnel. The physical impossibility of the task, 5 men attempting to move 600 times their combined weight, illustrated the desperation that fuel shortages had imposed on German forces. The transformation from mechanized to pedestrian warfare proved psychologically devastating for tank crews who had defined their military identity through mechanical mobility. These soldiers had grown accustomed to tactical advantages that fuel abundance provided: rapid movement, heavy armor protection, and the ability to choose engagement conditions. Without fuel, their vehicles became elaborate metal coffins that attracted enemy attention while providing no escape options when tactical situations deteriorated. Medical reports from German field hospitals documented injuries unprecedented in mechanized warfare: severe back strains from attempting to push disabled tanks, exhaustion-related casualties from long marches by soldiers trained for vehicle operations, and increasing numbers of frostbite cases among crews forced to abandon heated tank interiors for winter infantry combat. Tank crews had never been trained for sustained ground combat, and their specialized equipment proved useless for infantry operations. American forces encountering these fuel-starved German units reported tactical situations that bordered on the surreal. Sherman tank commanders found themselves engaging German armor that couldn't maneuver, conducting what amounted to target practice against stationary vehicles whose crews had insufficient fuel to seek cover or conduct tactical withdrawals. The psychological impact on American tank crews proved complex: simultaneous relief at facing immobilized opponents and discomfort at the apparent unfairness of engaging helpless enemies. The fuel shortage created cascading effects throughout German military hierarchy. Tank commanders accustomed to tactical independence found themselves micromanaged by infantry officers unfamiliar with armored warfare principles. Panzer crews were reassigned as regular infantry, carrying rifles instead of operating the sophisticated gunnery equipment they had mastered through years of specialized training. The institutional knowledge of mechanized warfare, accumulated through 5 years of combat experience, became irrelevant overnight. German logistics officers faced impossible mathematical problems as they attempted to distribute microscopic fuel allocations among desperate units. Decisions about which tanks would receive the last few gallons of available gasoline became exercises in military triage, determining which vehicles might accomplish strategic objectives versus those that would simply consume precious fuel without achieving meaningful tactical results. These calculations often meant abandoning expensive equipment and experienced crews to preserve fuel for other operations. The human stories emerging from fuel-starved German units revealed the personal cost of strategic petroleum shortages. Tank crews developed elaborate systems for sharing body heat in unheated vehicles during winter nights, as fuel conservation prevented engine operation for heating purposes. Soldiers who had survived years of combat found themselves defeated not by enemy action, but by the simple absence of gasoline, their military effectiveness eliminated by logistical rather than tactical factors. American soldiers advancing through areas abandoned by fuel-starved German forces encountered scenes of military desolation. Perfectly functional tanks abandoned beside roads, their crews having walked away when fuel ran out completely. These mechanical graveyards testified to the human cost of industrial warfare, where sophisticated military equipment became worthless without the petroleum products necessary to operate complex mechanical systems. The German High Command's desperate attempt to reverse their fuel fortunes culminated in Operation Wacht am Rhine, later known as the Battle of the Bulge, launched on December 16, 1944. This massive offensive represented Germany's final strategic gamble, a bold plan to capture American fuel depots and use Allied petroleum reserves to power a renewed German advance toward Antwerp and beyond. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding Army Group West, had developed the audacious strategy based on a simple calculation. German forces possessed barely enough fuel for a 4-day offensive, but capturing American fuel supplies could extend operations indefinitely. Intelligence reports indicated that American depots contained sufficient petroleum to fuel German armored divisions for months of sustained combat. The plan required perfect execution. German forces had to reach Allied fuel depots before their own tanks ran completely dry. The offensive's initial success seemed to validate von Rundstedt's calculations. German armor broke through American lines in the Ardennes, advancing rapidly toward their petroleum objectives, while American forces struggled to respond to the unexpected winter assault. Panzer spearheads moved with mechanical precision reminiscent of earlier German victories, their engines consuming the last reserves of carefully hoarded fuel in a desperate race against logistical mathematics. Lieutenant Colonel Jochen Peiper, commanding Kampfgruppe Peiper of the 1st SS Panzer Division, led the deepest German penetration toward American fuel supplies. His Tiger tanks and Panthers carved through American defensive positions, advancing within miles of major fuel depots before mechanical reality reasserted itself. Peiper's war diary, captured after his eventual surrender, documented the precise moment when German strategic ambitions collided with petroleum scarcity. His most advanced units simply stopped moving when their fuel gauges reached empty. American defenders initially struggled to comprehend German tactical objectives. Major General Anthony McAuliffe, commanding the 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne, received intelligence reports indicating that German forces were bypassing heavily defended positions to advance toward fuel storage areas. The realization that Germans were prioritizing petroleum capture over territorial objectives revealed the extent of Wehrmacht fuel desperation to American commanders who had never experienced significant logistical constraints. The battle's turning point came not from tactical brilliance or strategic innovation, but from basic fuel arithmetic. German tanks began running out of gasoline just as American reinforcements arrived with unlimited fuel supplies. Sherman tanks could maneuver freely while Panthers sat immobilized beside roads, their crews reduced to infantry armed with personal weapons rather than the powerful main guns they could no longer aim effectively. German fuel calculations had been based on capturing American supplies intact, but Allied forces proved capable of rapid fuel denial operations when threatened. American engineers destroyed petroleum storage facilities rather than allow their capture, creating massive fires that consumed millions of gallons of fuel while simultaneously denying German forces the resources they desperately needed. The psychological impact on German forces proved devastating. Watching their strategic objective literally go up in smoke eliminated any remaining hope for mission success. The operation's failure marked the end of German strategic capabilities in Western Europe. Units that had consumed their final fuel reserves in the failed offensive found themselves completely immobilized, unable to retreat to defensive positions or conduct tactical withdrawals when American counterattacks began. Tank crews abandoned their vehicles and attempted to walk back to German lines, leaving behind billions of dollars worth of sophisticated military equipment that became worthless without petroleum products. American forces advancing through areas where the German offensive had stalled encountered unprecedented scenes of mechanical abandonment. Entire panzer columns sat motionless beside roadways, their crews having exhausted their fuel supplies just miles from their objectives. These mechanical graveyards provided tangible evidence that modern warfare had been reduced to petroleum mathematics. Victory belonged to whoever could keep their engines running longest. The aftermath of Germany's failed Ardennes offensive accelerated the complete breakdown of Wehrmacht mechanized capabilities, transforming what had once been the world's most formidable armored force into scattered groups of stranded soldiers attempting to operate 20th-century warfare with 19th-century logistics during the brutal winter of 1945. By January 1945, German armored divisions existed primarily on paper rather than as functional military units. Generaloberst Heinz Guderian, the architect of German blitzkrieg tactics, submitted reports to Hitler documenting the complete collapse of mechanized warfare capabilities. Of the Wehrmacht's remaining 1,000 tanks, fewer than 100 possessed sufficient fuel for combat operations. While the remainder sat immobilized in forests and fields, their crews reduced to using them as stationary artillery pieces or abandoning them entirely. The mathematical progression of fuel scarcity created cascading military consequences that extended far beyond armored operations. German artillery units reverted to horse-drawn transport, moving at speeds that hadn't been seen in European warfare since the previous century. Supply convoys that had once moved rapidly by truck now crawled along roads at walking pace, vulnerable to Allied air attacks and unable to respond to rapidly changing tactical situations. The Wehrmacht was experiencing technological regression in real time. American intelligence officers documented the extent of German fuel poverty through captured equipment and prisoner interrogations. Colonel Robert Patterson, assigned to assess captured German armor, reported finding Tiger tanks containing less than 5 gallons of fuel, insufficient to move these massive vehicles more than a few miles. Many German tanks discovered by advancing American forces contained no fuel whatsoever, their crews having siphoned every drop for use in other vehicles or heating purposes during the harsh winter conditions. The human cost of this mechanical collapse extended beyond military casualties into realms of psychological trauma that military medicine was unprepared to address. Tank crews who had defined their professional identities through mechanical mastery found themselves reduced to basic infantry roles without proper training or equipment for ground combat. Medical officers reported increasing numbers of what would later be recognized as combat stress reactions, as elite armored personnel struggled to adapt to their sudden technological obsolescence. German attempts to address fuel shortages through synthetic alternatives created additional problems rather than solutions. Ersatz fuel mixtures combining alcohol, benzene, and other chemicals damaged engine components and reduced mechanical reliability. Tank crews reported frequent engine failures, transmission problems, and other mechanical issues that further reduced the operational availability of already limited armored assets. The pursuit of fuel substitutes was destroying the very equipment it was meant to preserve. The strategic implications of complete fuel exhaustion forced German military doctrine to undergo fundamental revision. Training manuals developed over years of mechanized warfare experience became irrelevant overnight as units adapted to static defensive operations. Tank commanders learned infantry tactics, while armored reconnaissance units attempted foot patrols across terrain they had previously covered in minutes rather than hours. The institutional knowledge of mobile warfare was being lost through sheer lack of mobility. American forces advancing into Germany encountered abandoned fuel depots that illustrated the scope of German petroleum crisis. These facilities, once containing thousands of gallons, stood empty except for the faint odor of petroleum products that had long since been consumed or evaporated. The contrast with American fuel abundance became stark when Allied supply convoys passed these empty German installations while carrying more fuel than entire German army groups had possessed since the previous autumn. The collapse of German mechanized capabilities enabled American forces to conduct operations that would have been impossible against fully mobile opponents. Deep reconnaissance penetrations advanced hundreds of miles without encountering effective German resistance, as Wehrmacht units lacked the fuel necessary to conduct counter-reconnaissance or rapid tactical repositioning. The American advantage in petroleum had effectively eliminated German strategic mobility, reducing their forces to predictable defensive positions. The spring offensive of 1945 revealed the complete mathematical impossibility of German resistance against American petroleum abundance, as Wehrmacht forces attempted to conduct strategic defense without the fuel necessary to move forces between threatened sectors or conduct tactical withdrawals when positions became untenable. General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group maintained fuel reserves exceeding 2 million gallons during April 1945, enabling American forces to conduct simultaneous offensives across multiple fronts, while German commanders were forced to choose between minimal troop movements and preserving their last petroleum supplies for emergency evacuations. The strategic calculus had become elementary. American forces could advance at will, while German forces could barely reposition to meet these threats. German military records recovered after surrender documented fuel allocations measured in individual gallons rather than the thousands of gallons that American units consumed for routine operations. Wehrmacht quartermaster reports from this period read like exercises in resource archaeology, with officers calculating whether individual vehicles possessed sufficient fuel to move to new positions or whether precious gasoline should be saved for potential tactical emergencies that might never materialize. The Battle of the Ruhr Pocket demonstrated the final strategic consequences of German fuel exhaustion when Field Marshal Walter Model's Army Group B found itself completely encircled with no possibility of tactical mobility. Model's forces possessed functional tanks, artillery, and small arms, but without fuel to maneuver these assets, they became merely expensive static targets for American forces advancing with unlimited petroleum supplies. The pocket collapsed not through tactical defeat but through mechanical paralysis. American tank crews reported the surreal experience of conducting combat operations against opponents who could not maneuver to respond to tactical threats. Sherman commanders found themselves engaging German armor that remained stationary during entire battles, unable to seek cover or adjust positions as tactical situations developed. These engagements resembled training exercises more than combat operations, with American forces maneuvering freely while German units remained fixed in place. The psychological impact on German military leadership proved as decisive as the tactical limitations imposed by fuel shortages. Generals who had built careers on mobile warfare found themselves commanding stationary forces, their strategic expertise rendered irrelevant by petroleum arithmetic. Staff officers trained in rapid decision-making and tactical flexibility discovered that their units could not execute any orders requiring movement, reducing sophisticated military planning to basic defensive calculations. Intelligence reports from German prisoners revealed the extent to which fuel shortages had penetrated military consciousness. Soldiers reported dreams about gasoline, with tank crews experiencing recurring nightmares about empty fuel gauges and immobilized vehicles. The psychological trauma of technological helplessness affected German morale more severely than traditional combat stress, as military personnel struggled to maintain professional identity without the mechanical tools that defined their battlefield roles. The contrast between American fuel abundance and German petroleum poverty became self-reinforcing during the final weeks of European combat. American supply convoys could travel at high speeds across German territory, while German forces lacked the fuel to intercept these logistics movements. Allied resupply operations proceeded without meaningful opposition, as Wehrmacht units possessed insufficient mobility to threaten American supply lines effectively. German attempts to destroy remaining fuel supplies rather than allow their capture illustrated the complete reversal of strategic priorities that petroleum scarcity had created. Units that had once conserved fuel for offensive operations now consumed their final reserves in efforts to deny minimal petroleum quantities to American forces, who already possessed overwhelming fuel superiority. These scorched earth tactics eliminated the last hope for German tactical mobility while having negligible impact on American operational capabilities. The mathematical precision of petroleum warfare became evident in final battle reports, where American fuel consumption exceeded German fuel availability by factors measured in hundreds rather than simple multiples. The Wehrmacht's complete mechanical paralysis enabled American forces to advance at unprecedented speeds, covering distances that would have required weeks of combat against mobile opponents. The surrender of German forces in May 1945 marked not merely the end of World War II in Europe, but the conclusion of history's most decisive demonstration that modern warfare ultimately reduces to petroleum mathematics, where victory belongs to those who can keep their mechanical civilization running when their opponents' engines fall silent forever. In the final weeks before surrender, German armored forces had been reduced to museum pieces scattered across the European landscape. Functional tanks without the fuel to make them weapons. Sophisticated machinery transformed into elaborate roadblocks by the absence of gasoline. American forces advancing through Germany encountered entire panzer divisions that existed only as collections of immobilized metal, their crews having long since abandoned vehicles that could no longer serve their intended military purposes. Colonel Friedrich von Manteuffel, the same officer who had watched American Shermans roll past his position months earlier, found himself walking toward Allied lines to surrender with his remaining men. His final report to Wehrmacht headquarters documented the complete collapse of mechanized warfare capabilities. 0 operational tanks, 0 fuel reserves, and 0 possibility of continued resistance. The mathematical precision of defeat could not have been more complete. The American fuel depots that had contained over 3 million gallons during the height of combat operations remained virtually untouched by the war's end. Military historians would later calculate that American petroleum reserves in Europe exceeded German fuel consumption by such vast margins that the Wehrmacht could have operated at full capacity for years without significantly reducing Allied fuel superiority. The disparity represented more than military logistics. It demonstrated the industrial capacity gap between democratic and totalitarian systems of production. General Dwight Eisenhower's final report to the combined chiefs of staff included detailed analysis of how petroleum abundance had enabled Allied victory. American forces had consumed over 15 billion gallons of fuel during European operations, yet never faced supply constraints that limited tactical or strategic options. Meanwhile, German fuel shortages had effectively eliminated Wehrmacht mobility months before formal surrender, reducing their forces to static defenders incapable of tactical response to Allied advances. The human stories emerging from defeated German units revealed the personal cost of fighting an industrial war without industrial resources. Tank crews described the psychological trauma of watching their military effectiveness disappear not through enemy action, but through simple absence of gasoline. Soldiers trained for mechanized warfare found themselves reduced to basic infantry roles, their specialized skills rendered obsolete by petroleum scarcity that transformed sophisticated military equipment into worthless metal. The strategic lessons of petroleum warfare would reshape military planning for decades to come, as military strategists realized that fuel supply lines had become more critical than traditional supply requirements. The American victory in Europe had demonstrated that modern armies require petroleum products as fundamentally as they require ammunition, and that fuel abundance could overcome tactical disadvantages through sheer mechanical persistence and operational mobility. Soviet forces advancing from the east encountered similar scenes of German mechanical collapse, finding abandoned tank formations that had simply stopped moving when fuel ran out completely. The convergence of Allied forces revealed the global scale of American petroleum superiority. Not only had German forces been immobilized, but Japanese forces in the Pacific faced identical fuel shortages that would soon render their remaining military capabilities equally ineffective. The final irony of petroleum warfare became apparent in post-surrender analysis, when captured German documents revealed that Wehrmacht forces had possessed sufficient ammunition, small arms, and personnel to continue resistance for months. What they lacked was the fuel necessary to move these resources where tactical situations required them. The German military machine had been defeated not by superior enemy forces, but by empty fuel tanks. As American tank crews drove their Shermans through Berlin's rubble-strewn streets during victory celebrations, their engines running smoothly on high-quality gasoline, They passed abandoned German Tigers and Panthers that represented the technological pinnacle of armored warfare rendered impotent by petroleum poverty. The silence of those empty engines told the story of World War II's conclusion more eloquently than any victory speech. Industrial warfare belonged to those who could fuel their machines until their enemies could no longer move theirs.